everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. I realized just now as I was talking with Joy that this is Author Talk number 50 for the Library Speakers Consortium. So that's really exciting, with a very, very exciting speaker today as well. Just as a reminder, the Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 350 library systems across the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host in conversation with each of the wonderful authors that you hear from throughout our series. And today, we are so happy to welcome internationally renowned performer, writer, and poet of the Muscogee Creek Nation, Joy Harjo. Welcome, Joy. Thank you for being here with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. And I feel like I should interview about your 50 speakers, the highlights and the low points.
No, people don't want to hear about that. They're here to hear you speak, talk about why you write, talk about your amazing body of work over the last 50 years or so. I guess we have that in common, 50 authors, 50 years of amazing creating. So before we get started, though, I want to let everybody know that we have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration. And you can also continue to submit questions during this live conversation by clicking the questions button that's below the live stream video. Keep in mind, we won't be able to get to everybody's question. There are a lot of you tuning in today, but we will get to as many as we can. Now, to formally introduce our esteemed guest. In 2019, Joy Harjo was appointed the 23rd United States Poet Laureate, the first Native American to hold the position, and only the second person to serve 3 terms in the role. Harjo's 9 books of poetry include Weaving Sundown in a Scarlet Light, An American Sunrise, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, How We Became Human, New and Selected Poems, and She Had Some Horses. She's also the author of 2 memoirs, Crazy Brave and Poet Warrior. Her many writing awards include, but are not limited to, the 2023 Yale Bullion Prize for American Poetry and the 2022 Ivan Sandroff Lifetime Achievement Award. She is artist in residence for the Bob Dylan Center. A renowned musician, Harjo performs with her saxophone nationally and internationally. Her most recent album is I Pray for My Enemies. She lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I do have to say that, as I was telling you earlier, I had a wonderful, thought-provoking hour listening to your album, I Pray for My Enemies. So I'm super excited to actually be able to continue that conversation from my car to now. So it's super exciting to ask you these questions. You mentioned earlier that a score was just written for you by Pulitzer Prize winner Raven Chacon. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, we're also excited that Raven Chacon Navajo, or Dene, composer and musician, just, I guess it was last year, won a Pulitzer Prize in music, first Native person to do so. And I've known him since he was probably a student at the University of New Mexico. And we had a same piano teacher. I was taking my grandkids over. I found out about her and then learning some myself, or we would do duets, but that's how I think I met Raven, through her. Anyway, Raven did this series, the Zikgalasa series of compositions for individual Native artists. So at NMAI, National Museum of the American Indian, it's been like 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
He brought 4 of us, invited 4 of us to play our scores, and then had an ensemble play one of his pieces. I like his he can write traditional Western, musical notation, but he does his own kind of notation based on landforms and
Oh, cool.
designs. It's really cool. I love improvising, but I love improvising to symbols.
Yeah, that's pretty
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, I'm not musically inclined at all, so I wouldn't even know where to go with that. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is cool. I mean, I've been traveling a lot, and when it's late, I'm coming in and flying, and so one thing I'll do is I'll sing the carpet designs. I'm walking down, trying to get to my room, and I'll just kind of look at the patterns. So it all fit right in.
So that's not the only new musical creation that you've been working on recently. You also just released something on Broadway on demand.
Yes, it's a one-woman show that it premiered probably 15 years ago in, LA at the Native Voices at the Autry, and Paula Vogel pulled it out for her, series, her Bard at the Gate series that she started during the COVID so that people could hear and listen to theater, American theater. So, she included it. It's the last one in that series, and it's available now for streaming on on Broadway on demand.
And it's called Wings of Night Sky, Wings of Morning Light.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So Susan has a question. Susan, well, a comment and a question says, I saw Joy perform in the Rio Rancho bookstore, a very small, intimate venue in Albuquerque one night, and she was fantastic. I never forgot that, and I am a fan forever. Susan wants to know or hopes to hear you discuss your process for integrating music into your poetry writing and performance.
Well, I came to poetry through my mother's songwriting. My mother liked to write songs, at least early in the years before it, you know, things happened and the music was left behind.
Mm.
But that's how I guess I've always associated poetry and lyrics with music. And it wasn't until but I didn't start writing songs or any of that. I walked away from music when I was about 16. No, I was about 14. I just walked away for a number of reasons. You can read my memoirs to find out. But anyway, I came back to it. I got into writing poetry. I didn't expect to write poetry. I didn't come up, and most of the poets I know knew they wanted to write poetry when they were like 5 years old. And I loved reading poetry, and I loved the musicality of it. And I'm very rhythm driven. Even doing that, I'm always aware of rhythm, and so poetry was a way, of course, of expressing that musicality and with language. And language to me is certainly it's a sound. Poetry is a sound art to me.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a literary art, but it's also a sound art. And if you go back to any cultural origin origins to cultural expressions, poetry and music are right there together.
Mhm.
And but it's different. Sometimes I'll sit down to write a poem, and so I'm not thinking necessarily of instrumentation. I am aware of rhythm and rhythmic patterns, and so some songs I go digging around, and there are some poems that lend themselves to songs and some poems that don't, but have become really, you know, you work with them. And I've even changed the form and everything of the poem to fit into to a song. And then others, like I'm working on one now, and I have the three chords. And I didn't go looking for them. I was just sitting here, right here in this chair, and I found this. It was really beautiful and kind of haunting. So I'm not sure. I'm in the middle of working on it,
Mhm.
and then the song will come. I might use a poem, but I think it's something else. I was looking at wind circles today and thinking about how how someone moves through grief. And so it's different. Everyone is different. Every poem is different. Every every song is different. The process. Some poems come to you. There's something. I have a poem coming out in the New Yorker on the November 20th, and that one came out of a sense of deep grief about what is happening in the world, in the Middle East, and it seems like everywhere.
Mhm. Yeah.
Called I Am a Prayer. There's a lot of repetition. I didn't sit down and think, well, I'm going to write I am a prayer, and then write a line, and then I am a prayer. It it just came on its own.
Mhm. It sounds like
Sometimes go ahead.
I was gonna say, it sounds like what you're describing, I've heard a few authors say is like you're almost like a vessel for what needs to come out. Would you
Mhm.
describe it that way?
Sometimes it's like that, I think. I mean, sometimes I finagle a little more to get something to something to come out, but it's like you have to get out of and beyond yourself. To me, it's sort of like, here's the small human mind, the size of your screen, you know,
Yeah.
and your small human mind is like that. But when you're working as a creative artist, or you're out in the land, or we all have those moments.
Mhm.
That's where you get people who can fix cars really well, or they come inventive. There's inventiveness and creativity in every, you know, in childcare, in every venture.
Mhm.
But as a creative artist, a lot of it, you have to just be willing to go outside of what you know and to let go. I remember writing in Poet Warrior, writing away, and I don't like, I'm a romantic. If you know my writing, you probably know that. And I was in the middle of writing something very difficult. It was a after a funeral of my stepfather, who was not a good man, trying to understand with his daughter. And I'm writing along, and then this line comes. It says, "Even the monster has a story." And I thought, that is so cool. I mean, I wrote it down and I thought, whoa, that it taught me something.
Mhm.
Oh, where does that come from? That's part of it. You're going out, whether it's with, even with these chords, maybe 100 people play these chords, but you listen and then you find there's little doorways. That's how I think of it, doorways and ways to move that are distinct and even different.
There's a line in Catching the Light where you say this the silence calls out.
Hmm.
So I kind of feel like that's what you're talking about right now. Just waiting for the silence to call out and fill in those gaps.
Right. There's something like that.
Mhm. So Deborah, still on the musical questions. Deborah is wondering, how did you get introduced to the saxophone? Were others in your family musicians? And in Catching the Light, you do have a vignette about that. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't remember what I wrote in the vignette, but I always loved saxophone. When I was in 5th and 6th grade, we would have band once a week, and I had a clarinet. And then I went to junior high, and the band teacher wouldn't let girls play. He said, "We need some saxophone players," and they provided the horns, and he wouldn't let any of the girls play sax. So I walked away. But I have always loved that sound. And it wasn't until I was almost 40 I picked up a saxophone. I was living in Denver. I said I would never live in Denver, and then, of course, the word never is very powerful. And I wound up there for a year or two, and I spent a lot of time going to jazz clubs and listening and talking with the musicians. And it I was at a friend's house, and somebody had left a tenor sax there, and I picked it up, and I had her write out the G blues scale, and then that's how I started. I went and bought a tenor sax and started. And but I found out after I started and playing is that my grandmother, Naomi Harjo, used to play saxophone in Indian Territory. And I thought that was cool. My
Yeah.
uncle says, "We might have her saxophone around here." I said, "I would be great." I wondered what kind of sax she had, and in the early 1900s, but I don't think he never found the sax.
That would have been that would have been pretty neat.
Yeah,
So
so I feel like I've got a saxophone ancestor, and I always thank Adolph Sax, because he went through hell after he invented the saxophone.
Pepper is saying, when was the first time you heard that voice within you? The one you knew was more innocent and genuine than other voices. Did you wonder then if it was your own voice or the voices of ancestors, the grandmothers, the creator, etc.? Um, yeah, so to finish that question, she says, when you write today, where do you feel the voice emanates from? It's a big question.
Yeah, that is a good question, and you could probably write a whole essay or a book on that
Hmm.
because I wasn't really aware of myself as even being a person with a voice.
Okay.
Except in school, I was very shy. I wouldn't talk in class, but the teachers would always pick me for plays because they said I had a voice that carried. So it was there, but it wasn't until poetry, and I didn't plan to be a poet, but I took a creative writing workshop, and something just kind of took over. It was larger than me, and I had to follow it.
Yeah, you went from pre-med to poetry.
Yeah, I was in art. I got into Indian school based on art, my drawings. And that's what I want to do now is go back to painting.
Okay.
And but there was something about, about language and writing and the poetry. It's sort of like it was almost like reclaiming the music and reclaiming story because my poetry writing came out of Native rights movements and being an active part of a Native student club and going out into communities and hearing these very melodic and beautiful and haunting testimonies of people who were speaking to coal companies and uranium companies, executives and government people trying to keep control over their land.
Mhm.
Because a lot of the communities would come to us because we were in the university, so they figured we knew how to how to broker with these people. So that was part of it, is really coming to understand that there is power in language of expressing who we are and who we were as Native peoples at that time in the early 70s. Because we didn't have a lot of, there were some we didn't really get to read our literature coming up. Even Oklahoma, which is huge Native population, many, I forget how, 38 tribal nations. And we never read our Native poetry in class.
Wow.
So it was, to write and then to write that way. And I didn't really see my writing as a public act. I kind of wrote for myself, although I was writing for the people and writing for justice. What's always motivated me is healing and justice. And it just evolved. I had no plans. It just evolved. So the voice, sometimes I hear my daughter in my voice. I was telling her that. It's like sometimes I will be talking and I'll hear her and thinking, my Aunt Lois Harjo, who I was very close to and love deeply, she's passed, but she's so much a part of me. I hear her in my voice. I had a cousin, Donna Jo Harjo, and we would always hang out and say she was in her voice too. And we'd talk about how she was present in us, in
Mhm.
our voice. And I hear it in a granddaughter who's just turned 18. I can hear that voice in a
We leave
couple of them. Mhm.
pieces of ourselves with those that have had an impact on us.
Right, right.
Kimberly's wondering, as a woman, how do you protect your creativity? I'm
That's a great one. Go
yeah.
ahead.
Um,
Yes, go ahead.
just to finish her comment, she says, I'm asking as another woman who, as an academic, my overtrained mind can prevent the creative process. P.S. I love your work and show videos of you reading your poetry in my women's spirituality undergraduate course.
Oh, thank you. Yes, when I speak, I often will talk to the young women, especially, and say, you've got to protect your time because there's so much expected, especially of women. I think about it a lot. I'm a great grandmother. I was a teenage mother, and then I was a grandmother in my 30s. Each comes with certain responsibilities, and especially in a Native community. And there's just so much asked of us,
Mhm.
much more than I've noticed, much more than the men. I've noticed that if I'm on a committee, it's usually the women doing the work, doing a
Yeah,
lot of the background stuff, doing setting it up. Maybe we're built that way to make sure that we're protective generally and fierce and ferocious, and we're transformers and all of that, but there is so much called upon, and then you add being a mother. I mean, that's one of the hardest and most demanding roles and jobs.
yeah,
And then being an academic, you have to, you really just have to be adamant and make that time for yourself because nobody else is going to. But
that's
it's
true.
harder to do I think it's much harder to do for women. Even I go through that, even now.
Yeah,
And as a kid, as a young woman, it was not when I was coming up as a poet, nobody thought it was important. I remember I got an NEA grant and I was National Endowment for the Arts grant for writing. And I was just out of graduate school. And I was so excited that I had money to stay home and write. But, family would say, well, when are you getting what's a real job? What's your job? And then people would say, well, you're not doing anything. Why don't you go by and pick such and such up? It's that kind of, you know, like, well, you're not really doing anything, those kind of attitudes. I hope it's changed. I don't know that it has that much.
I mean, I think that what you're describing sounds very familiar.
Uh-huh.
So we have quite a few people asking about kind of your creative process, and Kristen is saying, "What is the interrelation of your personal spiritual paradigm and how you write? So how your actual creativity and creative process works out." And a lot of people also want to know where you gather inspiration. And you kind of you touched on that a little bit a few minutes ago when you were talking about the three chords that
Mhm.
just came to you when you were looking at wind circles and trying to think through grief. So is that can you elaborate a little bit on your creative process?
Well, I was thinking about Audre Lorde, about the personal and the spiritual. I remember her saying there's no difference between her political self and her artistic, creative self, is that it's really the same. She didn't separate it.
Mhm.
And she was a wonderful mentor, ferocious and truthful and stunning. So, yeah, I don't see that. I think that the poetry and the music and I think creativity naturally leads you closer. It's all a spiritual path.
Yeah.
Creativity is a spiritual path. Um, so is, any of it. Our lives, our, mothering, bull riding, whatever you do, it's really all of it is a spiritual path. Though, I think about it, I used to when I first started writing, we'd go out and party sometimes. I'd be writing little notes on bar napkins, and the writing was like, "Here I am. What are we doing? What are the stories?" There's a lot of story gathering that goes on and reflecting on, how did we get here? How does this mean? And I think we all do that to some extent. What concerns me is that the social media and all of the Netflix and all of that, it can be creatively inspiring at moments, but at the same time, it starts to dull.
Mm.
It can dull our it's like an addiction
Mhm.
in which we go for that instead of like, wait, who are we in all of this? I think partly it becomes so overwhelming. I mean, we are subject to news and really devastating stories coming at us from all directions. And what do we do with that? I think sometimes it's more than individuals. are supposed to be dealing with.
I agree. And it kind of just pulls you into a hole even more.
Hmm.
There's a, a viewer named L Jack says that, you wrote about the interference of technology and how much is kind of lost in the way we use language today, and you're talking about it just now. And L Jack wants to know if AI has affected your life as a poet, or if you're worried that it will.
Well, I know that when there was a list that went out in the Atlantic, I mean, a link from the Atlantic magazine, and you could see if your books were scavenged.
Hmm.
And I saw that 6 or 7 of my books
Wow.
had been scavenged or stolen. You know, it's plagiarism
Yeah.
by AI. And I mean, AI is not going to be able to, it has no original imagination, but it is theft. It's intellectual property theft, big
Hmm.
time.
Definitely.
So I'm sure that it will, or it has. I was thinking too about how TikTok, or those little videos, I mean, they're up everywhere, and it's so easy to get pulled into them. They're entertaining, all of it. But what happened with me, I cut myself off from that, because what's dreams are my dreaming at night is very important to me. I get a lot from them, and sleep is too. But what I was finding is that, because the dream time, which is like creative time when you're in the middle of working on whether music or writing or whatever it is, a very similar kind of rhythm going on, and escape, you know, perceptual kind of perceptual speed, I guess, or going on. And what I started finding, when if I was watching too much of that, is that my dreams started acting like TikTok.
Oh.
It's like they were ephemeral, but they were just short. I lost content, and I lost that larger, deeper mythical sense of connection that we have with each other and with plants, and with it was taking that away. Because if you think of larger, deeper connection is longer, it's even eternal.
Yeah.
There's no into it. And when you go onto those, you think, okay, I'm connecting with this person, with that. This person's teaching me how to fold my underwear, and this person is teaching, there's, really cute kid thing on, and here's an animal over here doing this or that. But and you kind of feel like you're connecting, but you're really not.
Hmm.
You're really it's slicing, it's um addicting you, one, and it's your perception is being trained to be hungry for these moments, like little moments of candy.
Yeah. Like 3 seconds of happiness and move on.
Right, right.
Yeah. So, because you started talking about dreams and images, Beverly says, where does your unique imagery come to you? Do you see, feel, sense, remember, imagine, dream? Is it organic? Are you ever surprised at the revelations that get developed in your writing, but even just your general artistic undertakings?
I always get surprised, or I wouldn't do it. you know
Yeah.
I'm always, and a lot of that's about listening. Like, started writing a couple of lines to this song, and I thought, well, they're placeholders, but nothing is surprising me in the language yet. And I'm working with the chord. I'm finding new surprises in how I voice something, but that's kind of how I work. I'm trying to go towards something I haven't quite heard, or something that's going to open up the open up perception in a way.
Mhm. Do you think that the meaning of your poetry has changed over time, not only just to the people reading it and like the different generations, but even to yourself? Farzana is saying, do you look back at previous poems and reflect on new meanings?
I don't do a lot of looking back,
Okay.
but I guess everybody has certain themes, and I guess, certain themes and they get developed. But sometimes if I'm back, I'm surprised at what came through, especially at such a young age, and which tells me that, you know, that you're dealing with a larger mind than your small individual human mind.
Mhm.
Um, but yes, the process is a little different. When I was first writing, I was like, the poems would be like a one image poem, or one or two, and it would all be around that. And then they started growing, and I noted at one point that the line length and even how deep I could go was depending on young children and the children growing, that it really older the children got, the longer my lines got. Till I was writing, like, prose poems for a while, and then I've dropped back. I dropped back from that. Well, then I started writing prose. I wrote my first children's book after I had my first granddaughter because of the need to tell stories or,
Mhm.
with those younger ones and being a grandparent.
And those are absolutely important stories. We have your children's book, Remember, here in my household. It's beautiful. Um, but you also have written about a lot of difficult topics over the years.
True.
And Gabriel is saying, I was fortunate to be able to view your masterclass. And one topic that you spoke to that resonated with me was writing about difficult topics. I was wondering how you get yourself to a place where you can write on difficult topics. I think of imposter phenomenon, and it seems like the largest barrier to allow myself to write about such topics, since I feel like it isn't my place, even though they involve my life experiences.
I'm thinking about that. I mean, there's a lot in that. It's not your place. It reminds me, I was talking with somebody about this recently, and is that, words are so powerful. We're talking about another native creative about how we're told that, the words can create, so you have to be careful what you say.
Mm,
And I remember years ago, I took on a job. I always ask, oh yeah, Leslie Silko, wonderful mentor and writer from Laguna Pueblo. Uh, she would send me jobs if she couldn't do anything, and I had two little kids, and I was trying to make a living. And I was asked. She passed on a job to me to write a screenplay for the White Mountain Apache tribe, um, and they asked if I could write a screenplay, and I said yes. We didn't have YouTube then, but we could research. I could go to the library and look up, screenwriting. But what was interesting for that job, and I loved working on the story and doing it, usually you have, if you write for someone, you've got people that you have to, they wanted a certain kind of story. And I worked it into one of the traditional stories where a young man is growing up and the story really becomes part of his story and it helps him. But in a draft of the screenplay, and it was going across the whole council. I think it was, instead of having a couple of people, this whole panel or this whole, like six tribal members who were not writers. Some of them were probably very good storytellers, were having the last say on what I was writing, which was interesting.
mm,
And one woman got really upset because there was a version in the story was a place where the boy winds up in a bar and gets in a fight. He winds up in a place of evil, and she did not want that in there. But then her granddaughter read it, or her daughter came home from school, going away, and said, "But mom, that's necessary because he goes through a test and comes out it."
okay.
And those kinds of things are kind of hard to write. But think about this. This struck me as there would be no story without the challenges,
Mhm.
even in our own lives. I had to come to a point because I got somewhat suicidal when I was very young. And I got to a point where I had to realize that those things, that what had happened, were I grew from them. I don't always understand why things happen. I mean, we can question that, and sometimes it doesn't really do any good to
Mhm.
go back, except to find some way to I don't know that you have to accept it, but to acknowledge it and then to use it. I think of it as using it as building materials, spiritual building materials,
Mhm.
and go on so that you're not a victim, but it enables you to understand. It gives you an understanding, one, about your own ability to overcome, and with that, you can be helpful. That's why I've written memoirs. That's really why, is thinking, well, I don't really want to write about me. And I remember Wilma Mankiller, she did her biography, and that's what she did. I understand that. She didn't want to write, she didn't want a biography, and so she started her whole biography. I mean, it was co-written about the people and the story of the people. And I understand that. There's a team they want to do a movie on me, like a documentary. And I said, is there some way we can do it so I don't have to be in it? The stories are there and they connect up with all these other stories. So we're talking about animation. But
That's pretty cool.
yeah, yeah. So, but yeah, I understand that. Now I forget where I was going with all of that.
Well, I wonder if maybe what Gabriel was saying about it isn't my place, if it's what Deanna is outright asking. Deanna says traditional stories, including those from indigenous traditions, resonate with many of us because of their treatment of universal human themes and emotions. In your opinion, is it appropriate for non indigenous storytellers to take inspiration from these stories in their own work? If so, what steps can non indigenous storytellers take to honor the story appropriately and to amplify the tradition without diminishing native voices?
There's a lot to that because I think too that you think, okay, where did you learn the story? Do you have the
Yeah.
authority to retell it? Or you directly say this was inspired by, or this was given to me. Somebody gifts you, because that happens. Or, I was at a years ago at literary festival, and one of our native women confronted, there was a woman up in Canada who was openly getting stories from a Native woman up there. And she was sharing them because she really liked this young woman. And sometimes people outside our families appreciate our stories much more than our own families, maybe because they're around it and they take it for granted. And so she was enjoying spending time with this young woman who was writing down her stories. And then when she put them out, she made it sound like she was part native, or she waffled
Yeah.
and didn't really give the full credit.
Yeah, that's a problem.
And so that's the thing too. I was recently approached by a press about, you know, rewriting native stories. I said, I can't do that. I'm not going to, one, I'm Muscogee Creek, and I don't want to, unless I have authority from people to tell their story, it doesn't feel right to me.
Mhm,
Now we can be inspired by them. And I think you just have to, it just depends, I think, on the particular case.
mhm.
I mean, you can lay out, there are most stories in the world come down to about, oh, 15, or I don't know how many structures, like this happens and then this happens and then this happens.
Mhm,
So I don't know, it's tricky. It's really tricky because there's been so much theft, cultural theft and cultural identity theft. Some of it just heartbreaking that's been going on,
mhm.
especially in academic circles, and some literary and music circles.
With that, Lapika is asking, when you encounter misinterpretations or thefts of your culture or people, um, or when people are just displaying overtly displaying disregard for your cultures, what methods have you found that are helpful in, I guess that was the end of the question, but I guess helpful in overcoming that kind of grief and anger and rage even, I would imagine you feel?
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes you can call people out, sometimes it just depends on the
Yeah.
situation.
Well, because these days too, sometimes it could be dangerous.
It can be, and, I've always thought why we need to focus on creating a life, for those that come behind us, our descendants, and that includes not just our in those ways that I've learned from being close to my people and other Native peoples is that we usually include everybody.
Mhm.
I mean, there are children, are all the children, but we wanna make sure that what follows is nourishment, not just for our own children, so that when we write something, a lot of times our audiences are not just Native people.
Yeah.
Sometimes the Native people don't have access or they don't read the book, they're more likely to watch a movie. But it's important to keep that in mind, I think. There's more to that, and I'm losing it. I mean, I'm losing that thread, but there's more to that. I was thinking about how some people have what's irritating is that some people have made themselves authorities of cultural authorities when they're and invented identities when they don't have the authority, and therefore they can educate in a whole university how to interpret Native people when it skews
Yeah.
it skews the image or the human being, excuse the not just the image, but images are powerful. We can get off on stereotypes, and I don't wanna I don't wanna go off in that direction.
So we l- let's take a I guess we've been talking about academics. And so Casey's asking, what recommendations do you have then for educators working to center Indigenous voices in the classroom, particularly in middle and high school grades?
There's so much cool writing coming out right now. I think Eddie Chugalate Muscogee just wrote a book of young adult stories growing up in Oklahoma. There's a lot of publications going on right now, and I think, just including our literature and our presence, not as a special, we're going to focus on Native Americans this week or whatever, but just like here's American literature, here it is, and to know maybe what tribal nations are in your area as a focus,
Mhm.
because a lot of people they have no idea. And there's an organization called Illuminative. They were doing some really incredible work about, around this, looking at what Americans thought about Native stereotypes, and they came out with figures, something like 10% of 15% of American public thought that all natives were dead. And even I get a guy I play music a lot with who's produced some of my albums, Larry Mitchell. He, grew up in New York City in Bed-Stuy, and he said his teachers, they always say there's no more natives left.
Oh my God.
Oh, yeah,
It's,
just regarding all of the Haudenosaunee and all the steel workers and the Spider Woman theater people and all of that going on.
I-
So, and I think that's true for all, we all there's so many different. I mean, what is an American? I think about what is American culture? What is it really, or what has it become?
mhm.
Culture is really, you think, what is culture? It's really rooted in place, in roots to a place, story roots. I think of the story roots of our Muscogee people are in the Southeast. I've been there. I've been to where those stories began. I can point to things and say, there's where the tie snake lives. And all cultures have that. And that's what, and so then I think, oh, what is American culture? Usually natives are not included at all in American culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I would do is
Yes.
centering it as like, this is American culture.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So David is saying, looking back at 2019, all of the amazing things that you did while you were the US Poet Laureate, what was the most memorable moment or aspect of your role? Um, and if you were 2024's poet laureate, what would be one thing you would do differently?
That's a good one. Most of my laureateship was in this room. Yeah,
Right, because
yeah,
COVID.
right in this room working. Yeah, because of COVID. COVID really shut it down. For creative artists, we had time, at least some of us. I know about half of the creative artists that I know, binged out on Netflix and baking. The other half got to work, and because I wasn't traveling, I got a CD of music done. I got 3 books done, and we worked on my project of my poet laureate project. But I think what it was the pride. I think what really got to me is the pride that young Native people had, that
Mhm,
there was a Native poet. And that's what my project came out of, is like, well, I'm not the only Native poet. There's many of us. There are many of us. And that's that the project highlights contemporary Native poets.
mhm,
But I think that's what was really important about it. And I saw myself as a door open, holding the door open for American poetry and I found out, I think a lot of us found out the place poetry has, because during the pandemic and even now, we are faced with so many uh, cataclysmic possibilities. We're confronted right now worldwide, with climate change. It's not just it's true. Climate change, political upheaval,
mhm,
watching violence, seeing violence against women and children. Major watching. I mean, what do you do with such errant human behavior? People go to poetry. I mean, you always find poetry at times of transformative change. That's why you have a lot of love poems. I mean, that's transformative. Love poems are uh, "I used to love you" poems and country western songs, or blues tunes, or poems that are read at funerals and memorials and weddings
mhm,
and birth, because they speak. Poetry speaks when we cannot speak, or we cannot we do not have the words to express. And poetry uses words, to express what is sometimes inexpressible. So during the pandemic, the poetry people turned to poetry in droves, and I don't know that that's let up that much.
Well, I don't think that the, landscape has become any less scary.
No, no, it has not. And then once you've experienced, all the shutdowns, and we know that, look how quickly that moved throughout the whole world.
Mhm.
You know, it could happen. We're at this place of great, I guess it can be anxiety,
Yeah.
but it's also a place of great creativity. We're kind of in this deep awareness of a creation destruction phase.
Mm,
Things are changing in a way rapidly in our
mhm,
lives. But if I were poet laureate now, Ada Lamone's the poet laureate now, but it's changed in that I'd be probably out there a lot more. I would certainly be out meeting communities, and I do that anyway. You know, poet laureate, I didn't do much different. I mean, I did what I always do. I'm usually out in the public a lot. I have been,
mhm,
but if my laureateship was now, I would be out more. I don't know what I would do to change it or what I could do, but I would certainly be, more. I would certainly be more in the public than I was during my tenure as poet laureate.
mhm. Do you feel more busy now that you are, like, out and traveling around, or were you more I guess you were probably more consumed with what you needed to do as a as a poet laureate, and now you get to focus on your own creativity.
What I did as poet laureate is what I always do.
Okay.
Anyway, I mean, I did at the project, and I met it kind of up the ante a little bit. Um, there's another part. There was something else I was going to say. Now I can't remember. It'll come to me.
Uh, so Vincent says, I was struck by your lecture turned essay, Ancestors, a Mapping of Indigenous Poetry and Poets. Can you speak to both the importance of such a project and who you include, a list which is likely still evolving in the universe of ancestral poets?
Oh, I guess that's referring to the project, the Poet Laureate project.
Yeah.
And okay, the original, there are 47 contemporary poets in that project. My original idea was all, you know, all of the contemporary Native poets and all the Native poets. Phase one. Phase two would be we're all connected, like I spoke about Audre Lorde and the connection there, and we all hang out with each other and talk. You know, there's all this cross-cultural connection because we're poets or we're, you know, musicians, or, you know, we cross, you know, there's cross pollination and ideas and movement through this universe together. And so then that would be the next phase as well. Then we would, you know, show those connections. But the thing with, you know, we didn't have the people power. You know, we had the maps. I went to the maps department when I was made poet laureate. I went for orientation, and it was like I'd always wondered, you know, where you started. I'd been to the Library of Congress. It's a beautiful building and you know, so many resources. And I thought, where do you start? So I got to meet with different program departments, and it was really wonderful. And I've always loved maps. So I thought, well, this project will involve mapping. So I went there and got to look at maps and picked out a map for the project that had no names, only earth and, I say earth and sky, you know, earth, water, and asked people to write about place. But there's only, you know, like I said, there's only 47. There were supposed to be 50. A few of them dropped out for one reason or the other. But it should have been much larger. We've talked to a few entities about taking it on and enlarging it and keeping that up. But and actually, I think there was someone in Washington State that took up the idea
Good.
and did a mapping of poets in Washington State along the same lines.
Mm-hmm. Well, so today it was announced that Ted Blackhawk won the National Book Award. And so Kathleen is asking, do you think that shows a growing awareness of the significance of Native culture, especially in tandem with the projects that you were working on as U.S. Poet Laureate? Do you think this is showing a greater awareness of Native
I
culture?
think so. I think what happened, I mean, it just seems now we have watched people, natives come into popularity, and then we always say, well, and then there's none, dries up. It seems to be cyclical, but I think there's something larger building here. I think it has definitely tied to climate change, to cultural shift, and, you know, thinking about origins and origin stories and where we're going, and this country. And I think Deb Holland and then Charisse, what's her last name? Robert Charisse were made. They were Native women congresswomen.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went, you know, my poet laureateship happened. Sterling Harjo's Reservation Dogs. Now there's Killers of the Flower Moon, you know, about Osage oil murders. I mean, there's been several things. There's been several. It's like a kind of building of an awareness. And in a lot of those old prophecies that I used to hear when I was young, is they said, you know, I've always heard that they will come back to us, that we're going to look at, you know, storms unlike storms we've had before. Everything is going to amp up. There's going to be shortages, food shortages. I heard that the Mississippi River was really dry. You know, there's drought, that all of this was going to happen, and people would start returning to the story roots, so to speak, of this country, to see what there was. A wonderful book by Robin, the naturalist. What is her name? The braid. What is it called? Braided. Robin Kimmerer. Is that her name?
That sounds familiar.
Yes, I can't. Somebody's going to know. Somebody will
Yes,
put it up.
we'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there are definite ways that we can live with each other and learn from each other that have been set into place long before this system that has, that we all seem to be, that we're all caught up in, that's not working for people.
Mhm. So we've talked throughout this hour in about many different things, but it all kind of culminates to one question, which Sinesta says, "What is your why? Then why do you write?" In some ways, poetry seems to be a transcription of the soul. So, what is something that you find intriguing about conversing with the soul?
Well, I find it's because it's endless. I mean, where it's the immense story field, and there's always something going on. there's there's always something going on that enlightens a moment or shows us a doorway or a throughway, through the mess, through the incredible, beautiful mess that we're in, and makes connections so that we know that we're not alone. You can write a poem, you can pick up a book, you can listen to a story, listen to music, and you know that, you're not alone and that we're here together. And you can look at a NASA image of Earth and see that, wow, we're one body. We're one person, and these stories that we make and all of this you know, is in a way, creativity is giving back and putting yourself right in that stream of ideas and beauty and intenseness, and know that you have a part, like the woman who asked the question about not feeling like an imposter. You're not an imposter. You're a participant.
Mhm.
We're all participants.
It's a vulnerability. I think that's
Yeah. And that vulnerability is your strength. I think that's the sign of a warrior, is that ability to be vulnerable, feel, and to know that some things appear to fail, but that's where you learn. That's where the deepest learning stuff is, that gives you the most potent muscles. Most potent, that's not the right way to say it. The most potent, it's not
the
muscles.
strongest. Well, I think you could use muscle, maybe the strongest muscle memory to not fail. This is why I'm not a poet, but the words escape me. So then Cynthia saying, what advice would you give to young artists today? Or as Reed puts it, what do you know now that you wish you could tell your younger self who was just starting out as a writer?
To trust myself,
Oh,
to trust the story, to trust your experience, to trust what you know, or what when is just to listen.
mhm.
I mean, if I hadn't, I wouldn't be doing poetry. I mean, I certainly didn't get encouragement. You're a mother with 2 children. I was going to be in pre-med. Oh yeah, we can give you funds for that, and you're on your way. And we need art. But what happens when you veer from the most likely path
Mhm.
because something in you that you don't understand says this is what you need to do, and you're intrigued, but it makes no sense to anyone else. What if I hadn't followed poetry?
The bravery to follow it is astounding.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of people asking if you could name some of the native poets that you named earlier, or that you would recommend. So I think, and that we can end on that question, because you did mention several poets throughout our talk, but I think people are trying to write them down. So, what other native poets would you recommend?
I was thinking about Sherwin Bitsui, Dene poet, he's going through a lot right now within his family. So send him good thoughts. Wonderful young Navajo poet. Layli Long Soldier, wonderful poet. She was also a National Book Award finalist. Really fine. I think the first Native person to be a National Book Award finalist in poetry. And I think she's a wonderful poet. Let's see, there's a lot of good poets. There's Linda Hogan,
Mm.
really excellent poet. See what happens, and then I forget. I need to have a list here because there are so many incredible. DG Nanook Okpik. Her book, she was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for her book. Oh, what is the name of her book? Yeah, her work is so profound. Jennifer Forrester, Muscogee Creek poet, really wonderful poet. Oh, there's many poets and then novelists. A lot of fine novelists, storytellers of one sort or the other, musicians. I don't know. The list can go on and on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly been a pleasure to speak with you for the last hour, and it's truly been a pleasure exploring your work over the years. So thank you so much for sharing everything with us.
Well, thank you so much, Brandon, and congratulations on 50. This is 50 interviews.
Yes, thank you very much. I have no idea where the time went.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So with that, I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in to 50 Author Talks. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video, you can find a link to some of Joy's books. If you click that Rate the Program tab, there's a resources link in there, and that's where you'll find the link to the books. We look forward to seeing you all again later this month when we chat with New York Times bestselling author Naomi Alderman. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day.